Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second part of the Eyes of a Spore Companion Podcast titled Union Synchronicity, a very important term coined by the famous Carl Jung. We left off on chapter 4 of the novel, and now we're moving on to chapter 5 titled Queen Wright. Throughout this episode, we will see the dynamic and radical change of John's perspective, mundane day-to-day life, and begin to see the strive of motivation emerge. If you haven't watched episode 1, you could go back to youtube.com/@Kyle Johannesson to watch episode 1. So without further ado, let's get into it. Moving on to chapter 5, which is Queen Wright, which ties to Queen Jane approximately, which is a Bob Dylan song. Go ahead and listen to it if you're interested and don't want to listen to chapter 5 or vice versa. Either way, this chapter takes place after the day of the banker's party. It is John recollecting on the day that had passed, and a day and a half is a little too long for a hangover, but it's the time it kind of took for John to rehearse himself back to a position he's comfortable with after the banker's party. So it takes a day and a half, whatever. During this new day, Victoria enters the shop, and John now kind of gets the message. Some of the ditches are being filled up a little bit. He knows how to navigate kind of through the metaphorical ditches. John and Victoria kind of follow up on the banker's party, and Victoria tells John that, the tailor shop is the only thing that's hers, which is a little bit weird because John kind of says, hey, why do you come into here? You could go anywhere you want. You could buy whatever you want. Why do you come into my tailor shop? What's the thing? Victoria surprisingly says, this is the only place that's mine. John kind of has to unravel that a little bit. Victoria has this breakdown of confession. We start to see her Achilles heel a little bit, and it breaks down the walls of expectations. And it's basically a case of her father having this King Midas touch. As I previously stated before, Victoria is just so haunted and overbearing by her father's presence within the town. The tailor shop is one of the only real places that John has 100% ownership of, and the Wright Bank has no prospect in it. There's this weird awkwardness of Victoria telling John that he's the only one who doesn't shower her with compliments, but treats her differently because John's more genuine. And I say it's a bit awkward because John's pretty much lying to everyone. Whatever dress he puts on them or suit and says, oh, this is the greatest thing. And John was never really blunt with Victoria in any scenario that I wrote. John never says, well, you could try something else on whatever. So it was just very awkward for John. And then so after that conversation and this might be a little confusing, but John calls Victoria by her last name. And it's this weird, surprising thing that Victoria's surprised that John knows her identity, even though he was just at the banker's party. And not to give spoilers, but the main reason why Victoria entertains John is because she thinks John doesn't know who she is, who her family is, and John pretty much just treats her like a normal person, even though John is just treating everyone the same, like a normal person in a very linear fashion, which is very abnormal for her. Most people, like I said, in the town treat Victoria like a queen, hence the chapter of the title, also the reference to the song. And Victoria is just not in the business of being American royalty. She doesn't want to be this, person that they roll out the carpet for every time. She's a very rugged, wild individual to an extent. She wants to jump in the mud, dust off an old dress, and sit on a countertop without someone feeding her grapes. And she thinks John treats her normally because she thinks that he does not know her true identity. John's just inept at treating people of higher power because in his eyes, and especially in his late father's eyes who taught him, he says everyone who walks into the shop is treated equally, whatever the same. John could really care less about the success of a shop or getting connections, but John pretty much treats everyone the same, and he really doesn't care who's of higher stature because everyone has the same money and it's the same whatever it's printed on. And Victoria finds it refreshing, and John's just like, wow, that's what I do already. So it was interesting how John handled it. And then, as the story continues, Victoria confesses to John that she's going to New York for a few months to help with her father's business operations in the East Coast. And it's like, this is where it's like, oh no, this was going up so good. And this is kind of ties into Victoria not showing up for the ham. This is like, well, things were going so well, and now you have to go to New York? Like, what the hell? And again, this was written strategically. It's because if I wrote something where it was like, and then Victoria and John get married and that was it and credits roll, it would be a very boring story. It's almost like that Blues Travelers song. It's like a bad play where the heroes are right. Nobody expects or thinks too much. Hollywood's calling for the movie Wright saying, hey babe, let's keep in touch. Kind of why I had to sprinkle in that Victoria goes to New York. And then finally what happens is, and I'm going to show this image if I remember in editing, but it's first kind of kiss of Victoria kisses John. And I think I was told it was one of the best like kissing scenes ever written. I wouldn't go that far, but it was very subtle and it was very genuine how I wrote it. And I could tell you that. And I even write, and we both look at each other in a way I've never looked at a woman before, symbolizing John sees Victoria in a different way while also showing that Victoria sees that John now sees her differently, which is something you might have to wrap your head around. And then Victoria says, well, there's a lot more when I get back. And John says, oh, well, this is picking up a little bit. He interprets this as the prospect of kind of a romantic exchange. And then because John takes him a month or whatever to coordinate a simple conversation, he just stands there for a half hour and he just tries to calculate the uncalculated. And he didn't know that he was going to wake up and that Victoria was going to go and do this. And she's going off to New York. And I'm talking very fast to express what's going on in John's brain. And it just almost shorts it. And what does John do when the emotions overwhelm him? He goes and drinks alcohol. So John, in a celebratory manner, he goes to the tavern where his friend Thomas works. John talks to Thomas and goes to the backstory. John tells Thomas about Victoria. Thomas almost acts as John's advisor, as I previously stated. And John rarely seeks approval from anyone. But Thomas is seen as if he's the wisest person. And being a bartender in a small town, Thomas knows so many people that may potentially be someone who knows the most about all the people in the town. And Thomas is the shrink to John. And John does not take it for granted. And anytime, and you could assume that this has happened previously, or John has come up with some issues, maybe even the death of his father, John takes Thomas's advice very seriously. So John tells Thomas about this whole thing about Victoria, and Thomas gets very excited for John because Thomas has probably seen John and it's okay, you're doing the same thing over and over again. What are you going to do next? He's his advisor at this point. And Thomas says, well, Victoria's going off to New York. It's time to get your damn house in order and use her absence as an opportunity to reform yourself and bring yourself to a higher standard. Go to the tailor shop, take the dust off, comb your hair, shave, make sure those windows are transparent, get your house in order. Because when Victoria comes back, it's going to be, wow, your mind wandered off into something. And this kind of goes into the beauty of waiting for someone too. I didn't explicitly have John reflect off of this, but there's a hidden beauty of waiting for someone, whether it's a family member or in this point a potential romantic prospect, but that point to where someone goes away and they could do no wrong. They're coming back, but you see someone in their perfect kind of perspective, and as John prepares to get his house in order, he understands that Victoria can be this perfect person if he really, and I'm doing this off the cuff by the way, John sees Victoria is this perfect person even when she's away. So it's something to think about. After that night, John returns home, falls asleep, wakes up, and he wakes up very early in the morning, almost unusually early in the morning, to reflect that Victoria's gone. And you could put on your tinfoil hat here and to say John woke up at the same time Victoria left and departed. I didn't intentionally write that, but if you were to put this into a perspective, you could end on something like that with a conclusion. I skipped over this in the beginning, but this whole book was written as kind of an Ernest Hemingway's iceberg theory narrative. And like I explained with this part of the book, when it comes to the symbolism that John wakes up and it may coincidentally be the same time Victoria departed in this strange fashion. I use Ernest Hemingway's iceberg theory a lot in this book, and I didn't even know what it was until someone told me about it after they read it. But this could be a very, very simple story, and especially if you read it very quickly. And I feel very sorry for people that read this thing very quickly and just said, oh, I read the whole book in one sitting. Oh, such a happy story, whatever. And I hate that people think it's a happy story. But I use this Ernest Hemingway's theory as you could look at every single line in this book and really pull out some extremely rich and detailed stuff. And that's the reason why I'm doing this companion podcast, is to dig out all that inner symbolism that you may have missed, which is kind of that Ernest Hemingway's iceberg theory. On the surface of the iceberg, it could be a very thin and simple story, but as you kind of get deeper and you realize how much depth there is to the story. So that's one of them, and it will get deeper and darker as the book progresses. So now John wakes up, goes back to sleep, wakes up back at his usual time, and now starts to begin to notice the imperfections of his shop. And this is pure symbolism. He sees the dust dancing around his room, and for the first time, finally, John is looking above the muck of the day-to-day mundane life. And before this, his shop just disappeared from his view. It's almost like, saying, well, what color's your room? And it really doesn't matter. John's day-to-day life has completely disappeared from him. It's almost like you walk through the field of flowers and they simply just disappeared from you. And it takes a really great artist to come along and pick up that rock and pick up that rose and really show you what a rock is and what a flower is. So again, very interesting. This is where this part of the book where John finally picks his head up above the muck, and it took Victoria for him to do it. So John's, cleaning his shop, cleaning his windows until the birds fly through it. And at this time, John is essentially in romantic purgatory. He doubts if waiting this long is enough time for her and she'll never come back, and that's the hell situation, or if he'll just turn his head and just see her come into the door. Victoria never explicitly said when she'll come back, and John's in this purgatory. And I said waiting is a beautiful thing, but it could also be a very dangerous thing, especially for someone like John who overthinks. One could speculate that John is cleaning not only to distract himself, not only to get his house in order, but wager bettering himself almost as collateral if Victoria falls short of returning in his paranoia, which is something very interesting to think about. And this ties back into John's overcalculation of every... And I'm going to pull the mic closer for this. This is John's overcalculation of every single event and how it damages his brain. It is exhausting to read, and hell, it is exhausting to live with sometimes. John even says, in my case, the entity that I cannot conquer is my own mind in this chapter, which is interesting. And this is why I wrote it in first-person perspective, because if I wrote, well, John is paranoid, you say, okay, well, I know what paranoid means, and I've been paranoid before, but if you read it in a first-person perspective, I lay out all of John's thoughts. Now you understand it better. And there's some symbolism of his dust disappearing in the shop. That's now he regains consciousness and he sees his shop. He has an objective. And now John's waiting for her return, looking at the Wright mansion gleaming up at the top of the hill, which is that Great Gatsby lighthouse green light reference. So some time passes by and John is waiting for Victoria's return. And he says, well, maybe Victoria wrote a letter or sent a postcard or whatever, and maybe it just didn't get delivered right. So he goes and sees Lewis, an old friend, the postmaster, and he's going through the post office and searching through the illiterate letters that some people have wrote. And, he has a couple jokes that you could read in that chapter. And as he's searching through the mail, he finds the California Gold Rush poster, which he puts on his wall. And the California Gold Rush during that time was a very prominent thing. And that was essentially this call to adventure, which does connect, not to spoil it, but John says, oh, well, this is a really cool poster, and I like that call to adventure theme, so he keeps it, and that's kind of the historical background. And maybe you could say that Victoria is the nugget that he's trying to strike for, which maybe will foreshadow into something, and that's what John says. So that is the end of chapter 5. So now we move on to chapter 6, which is titled Fool's Gold, which is a play off of the Gold Rush poster that John found in the previous chapter. But anyways, Missouri is heating up a little bit. It's now day 80 of Victoria's absence, and now John thinks she's long overdue, and is she ever coming back? Then the paranoia starts to settle in a little bit. So John says, well, you know what? Let's go get a haircut. Shop's clean. I got the mail Everything's pretty much in order except my hair. So John goes to Ralph. John talks to Ralph almost in that therapist kind of setting. I don't think there's a town shrink in Independence, Missouri. So he kind of goes from Ralph, who cuts everyone's hair, and he goes to Thomas, who serves everyone alcohol and gets a better perspective on himself. But, Ralph is casually cutting John's hair, and Ralph tells John that, the Wright carriage returned to town 2 days ago. And John's like, there's no way. And so as the haircut kind of finishes up, John's like, well, let's check on the Wright mansion. Let's see if that's really true, or Ralph was just, had too much hair in his eyes, whatever. So John walks up the hill, and the wind kind of pushes him up, and that's symbolism for, the spirit and that call to adventure kind of pushing him slowly, the divine, if you believe it. And John goes and peeks his head around the Wright mansion, just doesn't see the carriage when he's there. And he says, okay, well, maybe it was either a lie or maybe it's not there, whatever. So he returns home, and then he has this frozen river dream at night, and it's getting more and more rapid. And that's kind of this intensity kind of building up in John's brain. And so the next day, another normal day at the tailor shop, and weather-wise, again, all of the weather in this novel is written with symbolism. If I say it's a sunny day, if I say it's raining, it's meant for a purpose. I didn't just take a dartboard and say, well, what's today going to be? And then I just pick, rainy. Everything is symbolism in this book. Too much is symbolism in this book, in my opinion. But the next day, the morning when John starts to open the tailor shop, it's a very windy day. And this is intensity, and all of a sudden, Victoria appears back in the tailor shop, and the wind pushes her in, which is that symbolism again of the divine pushing Victoria back into John's life. And Victoria hugs John and tells him all about New York, explicitly about all the different tailor shops and stuff. And even though John secretly wants to know, it's like, well, when are we getting married? When's that going to happen? Nothing happens in that department, and John doesn't entertain it. So Victoria presents this white wolf fabric with a blue thread, which is the same style Victoria had with John, the white dress and the blue ribbon. This is a little bit different. She tells John to make a 3-piece suit, a little bit similar to his size, but keep it a little loose. She's excited. She wants John to meet her friends and so on and so forth. Victoria keeps the conversation exclusive to talking about fabric. Not really a single detail of her experience in New York was ever given. And John's like, okay, well, Victoria's back and she wants me to make this suit. What's this all about? So in his normal fashion, what does John do when he can't rehearse a conversation a month in advance? He returns back to the tavern to tell Thomas everything. And Thomas, again, this is why he's one of my favorite characters in this book. He knocks sense into John. He makes him realize that the white suit is for their wedding. John says, well, she said keep it similar to his size, a little bit loose, whatever. And Thomas is like, this is your wedding outfit, my friend. Now, Thomas has a little bit of a jaded perspective, and John comes up with the idea that Victoria wants to marry him quickly because she wants to escape her father's conformity, and all this stuff happens very quickly, and he speculated that her return solidified her feelings just as they grew John's feelings during her absence. And this is where the jaded perspective picks in. If you have a shrink with a jaded perspective, you're going to have a very radicalized jaded perspective. So John wakes up the next day and he realizes that he's having this revelation of him marrying Victoria. He pieces the white suit and the blue ribbon, and he says, okay, this is happening very quickly. New York wasn't what she expected. She wants to settle down very quickly. And back then, marrying very quickly was not out of the blue. It wasn't something that was unordinary. So John wakes up the next day and realizes that the revelation of him marrying Victoria needs an engagement ring. And he says, where am I going to get an engagement ring? There's no jeweler in Independence. So John reflects that his mother or stepmother, I wrote that in parentheses in my outline script, who lives in his childhood home with her new husband, Gary, has her engagement ring. And when John's dad died, he took the shop and Sylvia took the house, and it goes into a little bit of backstory. And John feels distant from Sylvia and is only really reminded of her existence when he looks to the second floor of the shop window and sees that old house remaining. So now John knows he's got to go and get the engagement ring. He wants to get it from his stepmother, pass on that traditionalism. And you have this scene where John walks to his childhood home. And keep in mind why he isn't riding a horse, and draw that conclusion to yourself. You'll have to think about that a little bit. I'm not going to give that up. And John now, as he's walking up to his childhood home, who he's obviously hasn't seen since the death of his father, which was many years back, John starts to see the relics of his past, including the wooden porch, which is important, that he built with his father in front of the house. And John knocks on his childhood home's door. And really, that determines your relationship with your parents after you leave. Do you knock on the door or do you just open it? And this time, the relationship has just become so distant that it's a knocking situation. So after he knocks on his childhood home's door, he's greeted by Sylvia, who John references. He doesn't say mom. Sylvia lightly hugs him. They have this very light conversation. John asks Sylvia for the engagement ring. And without asking any questions and no sign, and Sylvia doesn't even say who's the girl's name. She just says, "Oh yeah, it's upstairs." So she goes upstairs and gets the engagement ring. And John kind of walks around his house and looks at the walls and realizes that there's no photos or any signs of John or even his late father in the house, and kind of realizes that the ghosts of his past have potentially never existed in this case, where he's walking around and seeing that there's no pictures of him, there's no pictures of John's father. And so now Sylvia walks downstairs and hands John the ring and says, "Well, here's the ring and you'll have to get it cleaned." And she says it's very easy to part with. And then John confronts Sylvia by not having any of his father's stuff in the house. And Sylvia essentially says that she's moved on and she's more in tune with Gary's family, but requested an invitation to John's wedding, even though she never even asked who the lady is. And as John and Sylvia part ways, John reflects that the past has been erased from him. He says, and time wasted over these last few years would finally bloom into something beautiful. And John retires to his bed, and the chapter 6 ends. So now we transition to chapter 7, which is called The Distant Song of a Young Poet. I don't have any reference to this. I'm not entirely sure why I wrote A Distant Song of a Young Poet. As you read the chapter, it kind of makes sense, but it's a bit random. You'll have to pull it apart and see if you could tell me what the symbolism is. But chapter 7 starts off with John's opening monologue, him saying changes are something we all experience as a constant. And that's John's new realization that this unraveling of change, this is the only constant there is anymore for him. The mundane life has left him, and now he wakes up every morning with a specific task, and that is Victoria Wright. And John reflects on the fact that if he continues to simply maintain his life, he is on trajectory for just nothing happening, and begins to realize that call to adventure is the only way at getting past the revolving constant of time. So now the backstory tends to settle a little bit. It's the summer and the tailor shop is slowly winding down. It's the hot summer in Independence. There's no air conditioning in any of these places. So putting on this very bulky suit and dress is something that is really not popular in the summer, especially in Independence in the 1840s. John is slowly working on the suit that Victoria requested, and John's taking his time because he kind of thinks that this suit is his at this time. John's kind of working on it. He's a little bit distracted. And he also notices that Victoria has not been seen in the shop for 2 weeks, and just take a mental note of that. But it doesn't bother him at all because he's just so distracted by this call to adventure. As I will constantly say call to adventure many times. I probably won't get past 5 minutes without saying the call to adventure because that's the whole book. So as John's preparing the suit and whatever, then he cleans the ring. And that's some sort of hidden symbolism, which is really obvious if you could subtract symbolism out of anything at all. And extract it. Cleaning is the renewing of the ring and the renewing of the love and the opportunity. John now tries to figure out how he could propose to Victoria in some fashionable way, and something that's very eccentric and something that fits Victoria's personality. He doesn't want to just say, "Hey, want to get married?" Sure, yeah, whatever. He wants to figure out how to do it in some sort of elegant way. And as John's kind of cleaning the ring, he realizes that it's a very unusual ring. It's a emerald with a gold band on it. And hey, that might be the author's favorite colors. Who knows? Take a note of that. So the ring is also unusual because Victoria is very unusual. She's not this regular debutante. She is this person that is really different from how her life was set up, just like John. So John finishes up the suit, even though I mistakenly called it a dress on page 60. And listen, this was my first novel I ever wrote, 80,000 words, and my proofreader, and we skip something every once in a while. And also, I wrote this book in 8-9 weeks. Blame Buffalo Trace for that mistake. So John finally finishes the suit and writes to Victoria to tell her that it's ready. And John knew that Victoria would run right over because she has that passion. But he still never questioned why she didn't have any time to come within the last few weeks. And the anticipation then starts to build up after John writes the letter and sends it out. And the anxiety is more controlled now. And he's ready to face the anxiety of Victoria's presence. However, he's nowhere in the league of being able to propose, especially in an elegant way that he wants to achieve. And the anxiety is still there. He's brushing off the suit, and he knows Victoria is expected anyway, and he's just brushing the suit off and trying to make himself look busy. And he expects Victoria to enter the shop, and that's the predictability of the unpredictable future. So Victoria enters in and says, "Wow, this is a really great suit." And let me just read page 62 to 63 because it's better off just to read it than actually describe it. So I will be right back with my book. All right, so we're back with the book, and it says, "Looks a lot better when it will get tightened up. With the intention of being more active at this moment, I said, 'So should I put it on so you could see it?' Victoria takes her eyes off and onto me and chuckles. 'No, Johnny, it's fine. I think the mannequin is good enough.' And she goes back and feels the careful blue stitching on the dress. Another set of footsteps enters the shop. A gentleman of the same stature as I enters the shop and wraps his arms around Victoria. It was the same gentleman that was dancing with Victoria at the banker's ball. A cousin or brother of some sort, I think. I didn't get his name. 'Is this the suit?' he says in a higher-pitched voice. It almost sounded like a hiss from a snake. 'Well, yes, that is the suit she wanted,' I said to him, disengaged him, and focused more on her. As she feels the white and fit fabric, he turns to me and says, 'I'm going to try it on and see if it fits.' I look at him. 'What?' I said I heard him, but I need to listen to it again. Victoria budges and says, 'Samuel's going to try on the suit.' Without saying yes, he takes it off the mannequin and walks back to try on the suit, leaving Victoria alone with me for a moment. 'Have you met Samuel before?' she says, staring down at the end of my shop, looking at him trying the suit on. I might have. I've seen him dancing with you at the banker's ball. He's a nice dancer.' I did not want to embarrass myself not knowing that they are related, but I walked back to the mirrors and he was buttoning the jacket. 'It looks good on you, but it needs to be a bit tighter,' I say to him. Samuel looked distracted at the suit, so I simply started pinning his legs to the shirt and make the necessary adjustments. I thought in this case this was going to be mine, but I guess not. I finished pinning up you both and says, 'This is an easy job. You could come back in 2 days. I'll have it ready.' Victoria said, 'Thanks, Johnny.' And they started to walk off. Before they walked out of curiosity, I said, 'So what's the suit for? Summer banker's ball?' Samuel laughed and Victoria smiled. 'No, it's for our wedding,' she said in excitement. 'Sam and I are getting married this September.' They both looked at each other and kissed and placed her hand on his cheek. I noticed it burned between the 4 rings in her hand. One of them was a diamond ring. And you could tell why I needed Buffalo Trace for that point. So it's very self-explanatory to tell what just happened. John was so overhyped about this whole thing with Victoria, started to have this jaded perspective, and Thomas also had this jaded perspective, and John's hopes and dreams fell before his eyes, and the flowers faded away once again, and he spent 20 minutes staring, which is a reference to the book of Revelation, and that was that. So kind of recapping, I know this was a bit of a plot twist, and this is where things start to pick up a little bit more. John had this mentality that Victoria was his, and this whole romantic narrative was going to unfold. And then because John didn't know the playing field like he usually does, and he just ignored the fact because it was just too much for him, he was surprised and saw Samuel and Victoria. So we'll see what happens. So John also writes the light at the end of the tunnel was just a shadow that I've been chasing for far too long, in reference to what he felt. When I write, I never say, and John was sad because Victoria and Samuel went out in the wind. I said the light at the end of the tunnel was just a shadow that I had been chasing for far too long. And you wondered why I misspelt, because I had way too much Buffalo Trace in order to get that out of me. So this happens sometimes. And John just looks at the suit and he just wants to tear it up. He just wants to say, screw it, I'm done. But he has too much respect for his craft, and his legacy is the only thing he has, so he chooses not to. So then John goes to the tavern because alcohol is his way out of his anxiety and now depression, and he goes back into autopilot mode. And John sits between two businessmen and attempts to articulate to Thomas what happened, even though his vocal cords have become super, super tight and he can't even say what he wanted. And John slowly and painfully unravels what happens, that Victoria has a fiance and his name is Sam. So Thomas feels a little bit of sympathy, and Thomas is like, well, I'm your shrink, but not the best one. And the two businessmen that John sat next to chatter about the name Sam Lynch, and that he's the son of Frank Lynch, who is the corrupt real estate tycoon who supposedly buys up large land masses and businesses, and Sam almost acts as the executioner of the business. And John, he's in this perspective because he knows for months he had this love story, and he's carving David. He's carving David in that block of marble like Michelangelo. And John just wonders why Victoria would want someone as though for her spouse, and is simply answered as maybe a merger of wealth, or it might be genuine love, who knows. But John he's in such disbelief by the events that he can't even speculate it. And John begins to understand that his preconceived ideas are simply all failing on him. And John gives up. He returns home. He opens the door of the tailor shop, goes upstairs, doesn't even bother to look at the suit. And John has this next dream that night, and he has a dream of wearing the suit in the wine-filled river, and the suit becomes stained red. The white suit stains as red as he wakes up in fear. He wakes up in the middle of the night, and he paces and walks downstairs to sleep on the floor underneath the suit, trying to make peace with his demon. So as time progresses, the morning of, John decides that he simply cannot look at the suit anymore. And the suit now symbolizes his failure and immaturity, predict his downfall, and it once symbolized, as he was originally stitching it together, it originally symbolized his hope and this prospect of romance, but now it's his downfall. And John tailors the suit and says, all right, I'm going to do the job. Back to linear life. He tailors the suit and sends a plain message to Victoria, your suit's ready, and he's unmotivated, and everything just feels like nothing. It's no longer that conformity he feels of living that day to day, but now he feels the pain of that, and knowing that he never got to see the Land of Oz after all, if you got that reference. So John expects Victoria to pick up the suit, and he's all ready, and then he's greeted by Samuel. And Samuel treats the suit like it's picking up groceries. He just says, okay, yeah, this is good, whatever. And he says, well, this is a pretty nice business that you got here, John. And, John already knows the background of Samuel being this like Carl Icahn type character where he just bear hugs businesses. And Sam delivers this initial threat that he's going to bear hug his business. And you might need to go on Google if you don't know what a bear hug means in the financial world. And then this is where John goes back to the tavern to drink more alcohol, and now he's in this horrible, repetitive routine for stress relief. And speaking of stress, I must stress to you that every 4 lines John's going to the tavern, and I've had people saying, oh, well, enough of the tavern. It keeps going back and forth, but that's the point. The point is John is trying to find that pleasure button. There are people in life who will simply just push the pleasure button inevitably, and John, that's his anxiety measure. He just goes and just tries to press that relief button in a repetitive routine. So John goes to the tavern with the intention of just drinking his problems away, and Thomas introduces John to George. And George apparently, supposedly, the head personal chef of the Wright mansion, or referenced to from Thomas as the cook in the ivory tower. And John's a bit intrigued by it, and George gives John the fly-on-the-wall perspective of the mansion and the relations between Sam and Victoria, and how he basically describes it as like just strange, it's theatrical. So although John seems disinterested by any more exposure to Victoria due to his disbelief in her relationship with Samuel, he is still interested in what he has to say. So anyways, George tells Thomas who he is. Listening to Samuel appeared out of nowhere, almost as a theatrical performance. And Victoria is very head over heels for Sam, but a lot of it seems very theatrical. John asks what Mr. Wright thinks about Sam, and George tells John that although he's not fond of Sam, he understands that Victoria is the only child, and no matter what his priority is to make her happy, even if sacrificing his legacy and fortune to someone who doesn't consider her worthy. So Mr. Wright thinks Sam is simply there just to con Victoria and get the right fortune, which is a plausible speculation. John discovers a gleam of a diamond in the rough by meeting George, and essentially becomes not only an ally, but a new perspective, which John always seems to be chasing into Victoria. And although John states that he wants nothing to do with this situation, he's done with Victoria, the deep call to adventure inside him is still burning. So John returns home and recognizes his thoughts, and the influence of alcohol not only acts as an anxiety lubricant for John's brain, but it also acts as a tool which he could have better clarity by removing all the noise in his head. And John underestimates that he simply cannot home wreck and eliminate Samuel, because he understands that by stooping down to that level, John has morals to an extent. It's just not something he's hardwired for. And the chapter ends, and John compares Victoria to a tulip. He wants to pull it out of the garden and replant it, but does not want to cut the stem off. Fundamentally, meaning he wants to move Victoria into his metaphorical garden without cutting it for temporary pleasure. And that is the end of chapter 7. So now we transition to chapter 8, which is called Flank or Fail. And this is not a music reference. Flank or fail is simply just foreshadowing what's going to happen in the chapter, like some of the others. So anyways, chapter 8, Flank or Fail. So the chapter begins where John has this over-dramatic monologue about courage, and John begins talking about the founding fathers defying all odds and the inner courage of the soldiers that they fought in the Revolutionary War. And this not only reveals John is well-educated and reflective, but also reminds the reader that he is in this heightened state of overthinking, much higher than before. And while not explicitly stated that John is comparing himself to the founding fathers, one could draw that he is in a nonchalant way with this new perspective in the call to adventure. So during the night, John comes up with a plan to defy all odds and confess his feelings to Victoria. And he understands there's a very, very small percentage where something would change, but he's built up over the many months this feeling that he simply cannot leave on a cliffhanger. And he's challenged by trying to get Victoria alone because he knows that Victoria is now highly protected by Samuel, hence Victoria not even showing up to the shop in quite some time. So John pretty much says, well, the odds have pinned against me and I need to defy all of them. John says, okay, well, here it goes. I know she's taken. I know it's in a love relationship and I know they're getting married. But screw it. Let's do it. Let's stop rearranging the chairs on the Titanic and jump off the boat every once in a while. And that's what John does. Don't recommend it. Not a great idea. But that's what John does. And see what happens. So the plan that John comes up with is he's going to make this overloaded invoice for Victoria about the unpaid suit for Samuel. And he believes it could create a sense of urgency, but also doesn't make it obvious like a performance. Even though, ironically, Victoria has fallen in love with Samuel's romantic performance, but that's another story. And ideally, John still has this elegant mentality in his head. He wants to go to Victoria's mansion, but he understands it would raise too much risk and not being able to catch Victoria alone. And it would be a little bit awkward if John confessed his feelings to Victoria in Samuel's presence. That's the quickest way to get shot in Missouri at that time. So John realizes that this is the only opportunity he has before the seal of marriage between Victoria and Samuel hence the chapter title, Flank or Fail. So John writes the overloaded invoice and gives it to Lewis, the postmaster, gives him a generous amount of money and says, hand deliver it as soon as possible. So John waits for Victoria, and to help his mind rushing, he goes off upstairs and he goes to get his engagement ring, almost as a symbolism of a totem, that something tangible that he could hold, to know that there's just some little aspect of potential. He's very bearish on this, and most people should be if you're going to confess your feelings to someone who's getting married in a few months. But 2 hours passed, and the anxiety is running in John's mind, and the sun starts to set, and its usual fashion, Victoria comes in, surprised by the invoice, while John is distracted by the sight of Victoria, which just throws him off, because John's really didn't see Victoria on a day-to-day basis, and it's just, this is the person. So John puts on this performance where he opens up the invoice and he pretends that he doesn't recognize the invoice, even though the ink is fresh on the paper. And Victoria, in her usual self, without even asking, just picks up this engagement ring and casually plays around with it. And consider that symbolism of Victoria's treatment for John's love, which in this case, it is really obvious symbolism. So Victoria goes around the shop and tells John that she wants to buy some dresses for bridesmaids, but tells him that Samuel insists that she uses one of his shops that he has equity in Kansas City for the dresses. Although John becomes slightly offended, but refuses to say anything because he understands the fact that Victoria is wrapped in Samuel's kind of romantic trance theater, which is the first subconscious sign that scenario will most likely fail. And so, out of nowhere, John finally confesses his feelings to Victoria very awkwardly. I'm not going to read it, but if you're reading this book, we'll go ahead and read it if you're listening to this. Pause and unpause. So the exchange is awkward, and John unravels all of his preconceived ideas and hints about how Victoria liked him, even though all these different ideas were subtle about the kiss and the dancing. Victoria realizes that she unknowingly got John's hopes up, and now realizes what the engagement ring on the counter was for. And symbolic significance of the engagement ring, John never picked it up in front of Victoria, signifying John's inner realization that he would never give it to her. It remains on the desk the whole time. It was, Victoria apologized. John said that's fine. Not even able to be doing anything. John just lays in bed for 12 hours in total shock. Puts the engagement ring back in his satchel and is just way too embarrassed to give it back to Sylvia. He just doesn't even know what to do at this point. So John continues life again, and he's back to his dull routine when George walks in by delivering the news that Victoria told Samuel about what happened the day before when John confessed his feelings to Victoria. And John learns that the whole thing made Samuel mad, even though it wasn't the outcome he expected. At least the ship burned before it sank. And this is really where it becomes the point of, why did John do that? It's a bit out of character. And I would assume 90% of the people listening, if you were in this sort of situation, you would just say, all right, let's just end it there. Who cares? And let's just let it die and let that feeling just become memory, and I'll move on to something else. But it takes, sometimes when something is so wrapped in your head, when you have this jaded perspective that you think the universe and the world is supposed to work a certain way, and you're so convinced and you're so jaded, and then it just cuts off. It's like, you can't end on a cutoff. You'll just be speculating for the rest of your life. So that's why John had to go and just say, listen, it's been a while. I have feelings for you. And that was it. And it's a tough thing to do. It's a tough thing not to do because you'll never know. But that was the outcome of that interaction and that love story that kind of came to an end. And that is the end of Chapter 8. Ladies and gentlemen, that was episode 2 of the Eyes of a Spore Companion Podcast. Stay tuned for episode 3, titled Jacob's Ladder, on this channel as we continue the story of John Vurduct.